The year was 1979, a year the world would remember, but few would ever truly understand. On the surface, the headlines told one story: revolutions, uprisings, and the slow collapse of old powers. But beneath those headlines in the shadows, another battle was being fought, a secret war of ideology, influence, and survival. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the alleys of Tehran, from Moscow's icy corridors to Washington's dark briefing rooms, the world was on the edge of a storm. A storm that would redraw alliances, ignite generations of conflict, and set the stage for everything that followed. It all began with a single spark: the Iranian Revolution. In early 1979, millions filled the streets of Tehran, chanting for the fall of the Shah. To the world, it looked like chaos. To the CIA, it looked like the end of an era. For decades, the United States had seen Iran as its strongest ally in the Middle East, a fortress of oil, intelligence, and influence. But overnight, that fortress crumbled. When Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile, the world watched in awe. His arrival was more than political, it was spiritual, revolutionary, and terrifying. Within weeks, Iran transformed from a Western-backed monarchy into an Islamic republic. Embassies were stormed, foreign officials were taken hostage, and the U.S. Embassy in Tehran became the center of the world's attention. But while cameras showed the angry crowds, something else was happening behind closed doors. In Moscow, the KGB celebrated quietly. For years, they had tried and failed to weaken America's grip on the Middle East. Now, the Americans had done it themselves. But the celebration didn't last long. Because soon, Soviet intelligence picked up whispers from the east, from a country they thought they controlled, Afghanistan. By mid-1979, the Afghan government, once loyal to Moscow, was collapsing into chaos. Rebellion spread across the countryside. Islamic fighters, calling themselves Mujahideen, were rising, armed not with tanks, but with faith and fury. The Soviets feared a repeat of Iran, a revolution that could infect the entire Muslim world, threatening their influence in Central Asia. And so, in December 1979, they made a decision that would change history: they invaded Afghanistan. Thousands of Soviet troops crossed the border under the cover of night. Officially, it was a request for assistance. In reality, it was an occupation. But what the Kremlin didn't know was that they had just walked into the same trap that had once destroyed empires. The CIA, still reeling from Iran, saw an opportunity, a chance to bleed the Soviet Union without firing a single American bullet. Thus began one of the most secret operations of the Cold War, Operation Cyclone. Billions of dollars in weapons, ammunition, and training began to flow not directly, but through intermediaries. Pakistan's ISI became the bridge. Trucks carried crates of rifles, rockets, and the soon-to-be famous Stinger missiles deep into the Afghan mountains. There, in caves and training camps, a new generation of fighters learned to wage holy war against one of the world's greatest powers. They called it jihad. The CIA called it containment. But no one, not in Washington, not in Moscow, understood what they had truly unleashed. By 1980, the war in Afghanistan had become a mirror of the past, the Soviet Union's own Vietnam. Helicopters burned in the sky. Convoys vanished in the mountains. And every fallen soldier became another ghost haunting the Kremlin. In the West, the world moved on: disco lights, nuclear treaties, Olympic boycotts. But in the shadows, men in suits and men in turbans were rewriting the future. And the irony? Both thought they were winning. The Soviets believed they were crushing terrorism. The Americans believed they were defeating communism. Neither realized they were feeding a monster that would one day turn on its creator. As one old CIA officer would later say, "We built an army without faces. And one day those faces came back to haunt us." But that's the story no one wanted to tell: the story of how the Cold War's final battle didn't end with nuclear bombs. It ended with men in the mountains and a war that would never truly stop. By 1981, the war in Afghanistan had already become a graveyard of illusions. What began as a calculated move by the Soviets to stabilize a neighbor had turned into a nightmare of endless ambushes, broken morale, and invisible enemies. The Mujahideen fighters, poorly equipped, often barefoot, learned to adapt to the harsh terrain better than any army on earth. They moved like shadows through the mountains, vanishing by sunrise, striking again by sunset. And every time a Soviet convoy disappeared in a valley, Moscow grew more desperate. But far away from the battlefield, in Washington, something else was happening. A new U.S. administration had taken over, one that saw the world not through diplomacy, but through power. President Ronald Reagan called it the evil empire. To him, the Soviet invasion wasn't just a regional crisis, it was a moral war between freedom and tyranny. And Afghanistan was the front line. So the funding increased. Millions became billions. Weapons became deadlier. And through secret routes across the Khyber Pass, crates of supplies reached fighters deep in the Afghan hills. American-made rifles, anti-aircraft guns, explosives, and later, the game-changing FIM-92 Stinger missiles. The Stinger was unlike anything the Soviets had faced. It was portable, easy to use, and deadly accurate. One man could shoot down a helicopter with a single missile, and soon, they did. Videos began to spread, Soviet gunships spiraling into the dust, burning wreckage lighting up the night sky. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. Inside the Soviet camps, fear grew. Pilots refused to fly missions. Convoys demanded air support that no longer came. And for every soldier who went home alive, 10 more arrived in pieces. But while the CIA celebrated, not everyone shared the enthusiasm. Some analysts warned. If we teach men to fight without nations, one day, they'll fight without masters. No one listened. The Cold War demanded victories, and Afghanistan was the prize that could humiliate Moscow. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the ISI became more powerful than ever. They decided who received weapons, who led the factions, and who was left in the shadows. The camps along the border were filled with volunteers, men from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, even Europe. They came to fight in the name of religion, not politics. Among them were young men who would later become the faces of global terror. In 1984, one name began circulating quietly: Osama bin Laden, a wealthy Saudi engineer building tunnels, camps, and supply routes. To the Americans, he was just another ally. To the future, he would be a storm waiting to rise. The Soviets, meanwhile, were bleeding both on the battlefield and at home. Mothers wept for sons who never returned. Funerals were held in secret. And in Moscow, whispers began: why are we here? By 1986, the Soviet Union was collapsing from within. Economy failing. Confidence shattered. Morale destroyed. And every explosion in the Afghan mountains echoed through the Kremlin walls. Finally, in 1989, the order came. After nearly a decade of blood and loss, the last Soviet tank crossed the Amu Darya River, leaving behind nothing but ruins, graves, and ghosts. The Americans called it a victory. The CIA closed their files. Operation Cyclone was officially complete. Billions had been spent and the enemy was gone. But no one asked the most important question: what happens now? Because Afghanistan wasn't free, it was broken. Tribes turned on each other. Warlords fought for power. And the men who once fought under one flag now became rivals in a nation with no future. The world moved on. The Cold War ended. Berlin's wall fell. And everyone forgot the mountains that had changed history. Until, years later, those mountains spoke again. They spoke on September 11, 2001. But before that day, before the towers fell and the world changed forever, another silent war was already brewing. A war born from betrayal, revenge, and faith twisted by power. And it all began with the same men once trained, armed, and celebrated by the world's greatest intelligence agencies. The Cold War had ended, but the War of Shadows had just begun. When the last Soviet soldier left Afghanistan in 1989, the world expected peace. But Afghanistan didn't heal, it fractured. The Mujahideen fighters, once united against a common enemy, suddenly had no one left to fight except each other. Power became the new battlefield. Different warlords, each backed by a different country, carved the nation into territories. Cities were bombed by those who once defended them. Kabul, once called the Paris of Central Asia, became a burning ruin. And in the chaos, a new movement began to rise. A group of young, religious students, Taliban, meaning students of Islam, promised to end the bloodshed and bring order through strict law. At first, people welcomed them. They were disciplined, organized, and most importantly, they offered stability. By 1996, they had captured Kabul and declared the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. But their rule came at a cost. Music was banned. Women were erased from schools and streets. Public executions became spectacles. And Afghanistan, once again, vanished behind walls of fear. In the background, something even darker was forming. One of the men who had fought during the Soviet War, a tall, quiet Saudi with a deep voice, had returned to Afghanistan. His name was Osama bin Laden. He brought with him money, followers, and a vision that would change the world. Bin Laden believed that the victory against the Soviet Union was not just a military success, it was divine proof. He saw it as a sign that global powers could be defeated through faith and determination. And with the Taliban's permission, he built his own network, a group that would later be known as Al-Qaeda. From the mountains of Tora Bora, he began recruiting men from across the Arab world, veterans of the old war, now without a purpose. They trained, preached, and planned. At first, their targets were local small bombings, isolated attacks. But soon, bin Laden's message expanded. He declared war not just on nations, but on the entire Western world. Meanwhile, in the United States, few paid attention. The Cold War was over. The global economy was booming. And Afghanistan was just another forgotten country, destroyed by someone else's history. But in the shadows, the anger that had been fed for a decade was now being weaponized. Training camps multiplied. Propaganda spread. And sleeper cells began moving quietly across borders. In 1998, 2 U.S. embassies, one in Kenya, another in Tanzania, were bombed almost simultaneously. Hundreds were killed. Thousands injured. And for the first time, the name Al-Qaeda appeared in headlines around the world. America responded with missiles, cruise strikes launched at suspected camps in Afghanistan and Sudan. But the mountain caves were deep, and bin Laden survived. He became a symbol, a ghost hunted by the most powerful army on earth. In 2000, the world was shaken again when a small boat loaded with explosives rammed into the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy destroyer anchored in Yemen. 17 sailors were killed. Still, few imagined what was coming next. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning in September 2001, the world changed forever. At 8:46 a.m., a plane slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. 17 minutes later, another hit the South Tower. Within hours, both towers collapsed, symbols of power reduced to dust. The Pentagon was hit. A fourth plane crashed in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 innocent lives were lost. The attacks were orchestrated by Al-Qaeda, operating from within Afghanistan under Taliban protection. And just like that, the world turned its gaze back to those same mountains, the very land once armed by the West. America demanded justice. When the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden, the invasion began. In October 2001, U.S. forces launched Operation Enduring Freedom, a full-scale assault on Afghanistan. Within weeks, the Taliban government collapsed. But their leaders vanished along with bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network. What followed wasn't peace, it was déjà vu. Another foreign power had entered Afghanistan, promising liberation. Another generation of Afghans picked up weapons, this time against a different flag. The mountains had seen this story before. By 2003, the war had spread to Iraq. The focus shifted, but Afghanistan never healed. Villages were bombed in search of terrorists. Civilians were caught between drone strikes and roadside bombs. And slowly, a new cycle of hatred began to form. For the people living there, war became normal, not a conflict, but a condition of life. Children born after 2001 grew up never knowing peace. Every generation inherited someone else's war. And for the world watching from afar, Afghanistan became a symbol not of victory or defeat, but of endless struggle. The ghosts of the 1980s still haunted the valleys. The decisions made decades earlier still echoed in every explosion, every grave, every broken promise. The battle that started as a war between superpowers had evolved into a war with no borders, no uniforms, and no end. The world had changed, but Afghanistan had changed it more.